So my name is Susan Norwell. I'm the co-founder of Rett University, for those of you who don't know me. I've been in the field of special ed for now, I think it's 45 years. I think at last count, could be 46, could be. 34 years in private practice, primarily working with kids with Rett syndrome, kids with autism, kids with CP, Angelman. But my primary caseload right now is kids with Rett syndrome, which is just wonderful for me because they're like my favorite. I know you're not supposed to play favorites, but they are. First of all, I don't want to claim to be, and not just because you're here, Stephanie, because we do have a real expert on CVI. She actually does assessments. And if we should get to that, don't cover yourself up, honey, because we're going to really be leaning on you, is what I want you to do is kind of give my layman's view of CVI. And if I say anything wrong, Stephanie's going to put her mic up and go, well, what about this and what about that? But I'm going to explain my interest in it. We have so many kids with Rett syndrome that get eye gaze devices. In fact, right now, it's fairly almost matter of course that they're going to get an eye gaze device. I'm talking about the States. I mean, if I'm talking about, Haiti, not going to happen because they don't even have electricity all the time. I learned that when I was there on a mission trip. But in the States, in Canada, in England, in some countries, there's lots of kids that are getting devices. What concerns me are two things. One is the kids that don't get them because they have some kind of visual processing disorder, whether it's CVI, cortical visual impairment, which I'm going to put at one end, at the severe end, or just some minor, we'll call visual processing issues, which won't be documented on any kind of brain imaging, because a lot of what goes wrong for a child with learning disability or has some slight visual processing problems, those things don't show up on an MRI. They don't show up on a PET scan. They're not severe enough to be showing up. Now, our CVI kids, a lot of their stuff, does show up there. And so we kind of have this differentiation. But I will tell you that where those two cross over is kind of hard to know. You know what I'm saying? It's where does this visual processing problem become CVI, and when is the CVI evaluation? This is where, Stephanie, you would be great, is I think a lot of times our kids with Rett, because they are not verbal, they cannot use their hands, they are not good responders to direct questions at all because of the apraxia. So sometimes I think, I have a girl I work with that has got a really severe level, supposedly, of CVI on her assessment. Nothing against the assessor, nothing against the assessment. But how much of that is impacted by her inability to respond to the assessment versus her inability to visually respond to the assessment? That's a big question, I think, for all of us to ask. Because some of the things that I've seen her do say to me, notice details in pictures and kind of reach over and pat them. And I think, wow, for her level of CVI, I'm kind of not expecting her to be noticing that kind of detail in a busy book, in a book that isn't just really uncluttered, that's cluttered in terms of visual array. But at the same time, there are lots of times where I go, oh, yeah, she does have CVI because she's got this visual fatigue, or days where her eyes just will not. I don't really worry about her eyes teaming. People get all wigged out about her eyes teaming. I think that's the least of her issues. I think there are days where the visual information isn't as meaningful to her. And that's where I see the differentiation between CVI and visual processing. So I'm more equipped in my early education as a special ed teacher to figure out visual processing. Is it that there's too much clutter? Does it need to be, kind of honed down? Does there need to be a little bit more contrast? Some of these things are things that might work for kids with CVI, but there's a lot of strategies we use for kids that have some mild visual processing problems, which means they don't use their vision as efficiently to understand what's in front of them or to organize what's in front of them. CVI kids can be even more severe than that, where they can't make meaning out of much of visual information. It has nothing to do with acuity. They're not blind. There's a difference between blind and CVI. It means I'm seeing things, but the connectors from where I'm seeing to my cerebellum that's telling me what the information is that I'm seeing is really making it difficult for me. So where we all know with our girls with Rett syndrome, how many of them can get really addicted to video, my class 6 kids with CVI aren't so big on watching TV. It doesn't have as much meaning for them. Unless it's just the movement of things changing will get their attention, but the meaning behind it would be difficult. So I'm going to give you an example. I have a little boy I'm working with that I believe has CVI, but because of COVID has not been able to really go and get assessed. So I'm going on the hunch that he's got some massive visual processing because that's all I can say. I can't say he has CVI because I am not certified like Stephanie is to be able to give an assessment and give that diagnosis. What I can say, though, is the way he tracks light, any kind of light coming across is what catches his attention versus other things in his environment. In front of his eye gaze device, he definitely has field preference, spot preference, which we also see in kids that have CVI. He also is doing better at reading words than he is at looking at symbols or pictures. And I have a 19-year-old I work with that is classic, pretty classic, and has the diagnosis for many, many years. I do think that people have to understand, and all the reading that I've done is that over time, they can get better. Their vision can improve, not because not their vision, but their ability to process what they're seeing gets better because our brains are plastic. This neuroplasticity that we're learning about in our brains mean the more often we try to make connections, the more dendrites, the more connections are made in our brain, which can be helpful. He is a great reader. And actually over time, his text can get a little smaller. So I'm not having to put, 8 words on a page, which makes a book very, very long. So it's this kind of different way of looking at things because what is salient or what is most easy for them to make meaning from is the things that we usually think are harder. So as young children, what I feel bad for my kids with CVI is as young children because people want to know, where's blue, where's green, where's yellow? And they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where they are because I'm really not processing difference in colors. What about this shape? What about, can you find the dog in this farm picture versus the cow? And if they don't find it, then what do they get hit with? They get hit with a cognitive disorder. When in fact, if they had had words for those things, they might have been able to find the words for those things, which is we think, a higher level skill, which it is cognitively, but visually for them, easier. So how I view CVI is that it's much more of I don't want to say damage, but yes, a damage to the brain in terms of how things are processed, which can show up medically in a scan. A visual processing disorder is probably also damage to the brain. It's just so little in terms of what we know about the brain, we're not able to measure it yet. It's like, you can't look at a kid's brain. A PET scan for ADHD is kind of hard to determine do they have ADHD or not? Because we just haven't gotten that sophisticated in our measurements. Will we? Sure. There years ago, we didn't have measurements for CVI, and now you can probably give an assessment, right, Stephanie, and you could probably get a scan of some kind that would support the fact that there is CVI. And you might even have some information that would help you in terms of areas of deficit. Is that true? Yeah, you're nodding your head. Okay, lovely. So to me, I think that this difficulty is something we look out for. So let's think about some of the characteristics that help us, all right? So one of them would be, like I said before, that this idea of movement, things that move for them are things that get their attention. Now, that's difficult in schools because we're often asking kids to sit still and looking at still objects in order to show what you know, but that is one of the things that helps them. Color preference. There are kids that will have a definite color preference. I have some kids that I've noticed really like red. On a talker, that red stop sign for stop has got to go. Got to have another symbol or another word for stop, because if it's in red, they're going to be on it all the time, not because they want to say stop, but because they're so attracted to the color visually, they can't help it. They just can't. It just doesn't, you know? I have the young man I'm working with who's 19, and I've been working with him a while. The minute the sun changes levels and the light changes to one or other of the sides, and we're working with a black background behind us. I have a black background, so I close in that visual field. I unclutter it as much as possible so that what he's looking at is what he's looking at. But the minute that light changes, you can just see him going like this. And I go, that's your brain telling you that you need to look there, but you are smarter than that. You need to tell yourself, I don't need to look at the light. And over time, what he's been doing is he's been catching himself as he goes. I say, I'll just make a little pause and he'll bring himself back. Now, that's been a lot of talking him through it. He's a very bright kid, very bright. But I will tell you, because of his visual impairment and his CP, he was erroneously labeled as severely cognitively impaired until we could figure out that he could read. I mean, that was the breakthrough for him, and he's a writer. So he's not a kid with Rett, but he's who taught me the most about CVI, and now I start thinking about it as I'm looking at all of my clients. Visual field preferences. You'll have kids. I have a young girl I'm working with in in Switzerland, who has a definite right side preference. She just comes in, everything's on the right. How I set up her talker, how I set up her reading, how I set up things to help her so she can move to the left as her eyes warm up. And that is something I have noticed about my kids with CVI. Is as sometimes the beginning of an activity when you're doing it, they are like all over the place visually. But then as you start showing them or modeling or getting to different areas on their device or different areas in a book, all of a sudden the range increases and they're not just landing on that right side. So there are some things I always say to people, a label doesn't mean they can't do. A label just means we got to figure out what to do. And that's the thing about CVI. But if you don't understand it and you don't understand the visual processing aspect of it, you're going to think they just don't know what's going on. Visual latency. We should know this in Rett, because in Rett, we know how long it takes for kids to respond to a lot of things. Not that they don't understand what we're saying, but their response is slow. Visual latency for a child with CVI is the same. It takes a while for their eyes to get there. The little boy I was working with today, I said, you know, buddy, when you're ready, when your body's calm and when you're ready, you'll look and find one of the words. We were reading a book, Mom and I, and there were different animals. And I waited, and I might have waited to the count of 20. I got to tell you, most people don't wait that long. Sure enough, he picked up his head and he looked at the word for, I can't even remember what it was, but lion or something like that. And I went, good for you. You found lion. And the look on his face, he was so happy. Because I think when people don't wait long enough, what you then get is this learned helplessness of, well, why should I bother? They're not going to wait for me anyway. And that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. The complexity of a visual array, and I think sometimes we forget how complex of an array or images that we can process without a bit of a problem. And we have to put ourselves in their shoes and realize. So I have some books I use to kind of sort this out, but I have this book called That Is Not a Good Idea by Mo Willems, and it is a black book with big white print, and the pictures are very distinct, and there's a high contrast of yellow. It's like the greatest book for kids that have any kind of visual processing, whether it's CVI or not. And being able to watch them notice things in that book because it's not cluttered really helps me understand how I can better make my materials match that so that it helps them. The complexity of the sensory environment. Oh my gosh, this is my Hayden. If there is the least noise, if there is the least activity going on, if I sneeze, things like that will cause her to totally lose all visual contact with whatever we're trying to do. It is as if in order to visually process, she cannot multi-process, which again, we take for granted. It's like people say, well, can you walk and chew gum? I said, on some days I can. Yes, I can walk and chew gum. But this is more like we don't even really get how often we are bombarding kids with multi-sensory. Like they're sitting in their chair and they're trying to figure out where they are in space. We're bombarding with verbal and they're getting visual. And at the same time, all their peers around them are pouring in verbal and movement. And there's lights. And there's all this stuff coming at them. We say, we just don't know why they can't pay attention. Gosh, these kids aren't sure what to pay attention to, for one thing. And for another thing, again, any change, any movement is what's going to catch them. And so it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Human faces can be difficult. I mentioned the need for lights. Some of the kids work really well off of a light board. I don't use those as much. I'm not a vision therapist, but if a vision therapist said to me, they'd learn their sight words better, if I'm teaching kids how to read, I would do it. But I've found other ways to do it. It's hard for them to look at things distance-wise. Things far away for them just, I think, blur into a big, like nothing. And I think that's why I tend to snug in the visual field. And tell you the truth, I snug in the visual field even for kids who have mild visual processing disorders or attentional issues that might be related to something besides their vision, because it just helps them. And I think those are the main ones. Oh, this is huge. Two of them that I almost forgot. Absence of visually guided reach. So here we are expecting kids to have their hands and their eyes together. And what might happen is we might get a fleeting glimpse at what they're aiming for and a head turn and then a reach. Or we might get a reach first and then the vision, which isn't usually as effective in terms of getting to what you actually want to get to. But again, I do think that in Rett, we are so used to following the eyes first and the hands second, because their hands are probably the least effective. And so we're pretty good at already doing that. So that can be really helpful. And then the difficulty with visual novelty. So this little boy this morning, it's so cool. His mom gets the same book. This was her idea, actually. I'm on Zoom. And Zoom is not the best for him, I know, because it's on a screen. Though he does like to look at me. I mean, he's gotten so familiar with me and so familiar with where I'm going to be positioned that he does look in my direction and smile and make some kind of contact. But his mom has the same book to show him the details. And what I feel like with my kids with CVI, which is different than my kids with a visual processing disorder, I feel oftentimes like I am interpreting the picture for them. So I'll say things like, there's a barn on this page and it's red, and it has like these sides that are straight, but then it's got, these kind of things that's a roof. So there's a barn in the middle, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to let you feel where the middle is. And I might describe, and then there is this elephant, like we were reading the elephant, there's a bird on my head today. There's this elephant, and now a bird just sat on his head. Now, I'm not telling him that it's good, bad, or anything. I'm actually explaining what he would be seeing and understanding if he could process it. And what I find about my kids that do have CVI that I work with is they understand things. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of understanding of language, But because they don't do so much, people aren't sure they understand language. So then they really dumb things down and then the kids get bored to tears and then that's horrible. But I do a lot of explaining the pictures, or in my books that I make on a screen, the images are highlighted so that they know that there's an image there that they should be looking at. And when they look at it, I can say, oh, you found the lion, or you found the baby elephant, so that they're not totally like not engaged with what's going on. Okay, so I'm at 7:22. Now let's go away from CVI for the moment and go just to visual processing. So, visual processing is probably the global term. There's a global term, visual processing, of which CVI is at this extreme end of things. Mild visual processing issues could be anywhere from, I can't quite look at the blackboard and copy down something. Now, that's not an issue for our Rett population because they're not going to be holding a pencil copying down. But it also could be that if they are far point in a classroom watching the teacher do something on the board that you're trying to explain to them at near point, that there's going to be a loss of information there in that transition between near and far. It could be the kid who does great when you have everything in broad strokes on like I do all my letters with a broad marker on either like a fluorescent green color for the vowels and a different bright color for the consonants. So that when I'm teaching decoding and doing making words activities, they can see the difference between a vowel and a consonant. Every syllable, every word has to have a vowel, every syllable has to have a vowel. Helps. But for kids that have visual processing issues, that can be really helpful because now they're like, okay, wait a minute. I'm looking at that word and there is no green in it, which means there's none of that fluorescent green, which maybe CVI wouldn't pick up, but visual processing kids, mild visual processing kids would pick up. And they're like, I need to add something in here. They could have trouble discriminating between letters. So I have, which could be also CVI too, and visual processing, like the letter N versus the letter H, lowercase. The only difference is the length of that one side. If it's tall, it's an H. If it's short, and it's an N. And that can be really difficult. We're very well aware of the B and the D issue, them just being reversed. But there are letters that look a lot alike, an M and an N. Really, there's only one little extra bump. And if you're not processing all the way across an image, you might miss that. And so I'm hoping that I'm not freaking people out here and making everybody run for the hills thinking that their kid might have CVI. That's not the point. The point is here, before we end, is that if your child is having difficulty recognizing things in cluttered spaces, if they are very attracted to light, if the attraction to light is such that it's hard to hold their attention to things, if they've had a talker, you've done a lot of modeling and you're still finding that they are always in the same spot and they're not moving any place, or they are really not paying that much visual attention to it at all, and so you might say to yourself, oh, they just can't do this. There are so many settings and so many things we can do on the talkers, even the eye gaze devices now that help. So I'm a big fan of Grid because Grid has so many settings, but I did a whole free course on this. So any of you using Grid, you can go look on RettU. They have a setting. First of all, they can make what I model one color and what they say another color, which is really helpful because now the kiddo can see my modeling. And if you're doing any kind of screen capture like I do, I know what I've said and I know what they've said. But I set theirs so that when they hit it, it colors the background and telescopes in. Like pulls their vision into that symbol. And I have found that to be such a helpful setting for my kids. They will actually now come, I'll have my, mouse, because I'm remote, on their talker. So it's lighting up the symbol I'm trying to model. I'll just hold it there for a fraction of a second longer. They will get there. I'll take mine away, and they will telescope on into it. And they can then get back to it time and again because they've experienced the plan. So I always say, don't give up. I mean, I think there are some language settings and some language systems that are not great for kids that have CVI or have visual processing issues. But that doesn't mean there isn't something that will work for them if we're creative and we think it through. Stephanie, would you mind if I asked you anything you would like to add, anything that I said that was wrong? Now I feel like Rachel Maddow. That's what she says with every person that she interviews. Anything that I may have gotten messed up that would help our listeners, because really I have a great deal of respect for anybody doing assessments on CVI. So shoot, go ahead, unmute yourself and go at it.
I mean, I think you got pretty much all of it pretty on target. I think one thing I do want to mention about movement. So, I think, you spoke about how movement can definitely be a distractor for students with CVI. It can also be used to actually help visual processing for kids with cortical visual impairment. A particular student that I've worked with had absolutely no interest in books until he started reading them in a swing while being in motion. And his visual processing improved tenfold when they were able to do that because he was having the actual book or screen or whatever was in front of him. He was, the background of everything around him was in motion. And so then he was able to better visually attend to something that was more static. So
he's sitting on a swing, not cocooned, but on a swing. So everything around him's moving, but that was still so he could focus. Boy, that's like, that I would never thought of. That is great information.
And for our kids, I mean, PowerPoint and Google Slides is so great for this, especially when I'm working on any sort of literacy, letter, sight words and things with kids, having the word dance around the screen is amazing for visual processing, and really, really helps kids, especially too with Google Slides and PowerPoint. You can slow it down so it's so slow as it moves across the screen very slowly, and that movement attracts their attention, and then they're able to visually attend to the word. So modern technology, I think, definitely helps a lot of making these types of supports a lot easier so that you don't have to get into a swing necessarily to be able to help a kid visually attend to his work.
How do you, when you're doing an assessment, accommodate to kids who really can't point or can't respond? Their motor responses are a problem because of apraxia, like in Rett syndrome. How do you discriminate between that and the fact that they can't visually respond?
Yeah, and it definitely, so because, cortical visual impairment, there are 3 phases of cortical visual impairment. And the earlier phase kiddos who really have very little functioning vision, or functional, day-to-day vision, are actually a lot easier to assess. And you wouldn't think that would be the case, but a lot of the assessment that you do is really based on visual behaviors with those earlier phase, those kids who really have very limited visual functioning at that point. When you get into the later phases, it can be definitely a challenge to assess kids who have complex communication needs, because there's just a lot that they may have a hard time sharing with you about what they can see. I will say that I'm fortunate to, work in a school where, all of my students have robust devices and really great partner strategies. So, I think.
Where are you?
Atlanta, Georgia. I work at a small school called the Ellis Center.
Excellent. Boy, that is great to hear. Good. Did you get our email? All right, good. Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of it is based on, visual behaviors. Like, for example, when you're assessing field preference, you can do things like taking a light, bringing it in different fields and then just waiting for the student once they, notice it in front of them. But definitely when it gets to the later phases, that's where you have to be able to have some way to understand and get information from the child about what they're seeing. Or, you can do it without it, but it's very, very difficult.
Right, and I think that's why some of our kids might get a worse rating than maybe what they're able to do. Or one of the other things is because the young lady I'm thinking of that really had really severe, I think that the more we got her eye gaze device with some great settings for her, that scoping, different colors, instead of this whitewashed background, it's got a darker background, not black. Sometimes I think that's a little too stark, but maybe a really dark gray. She now wants to use it so much that she wants to practice using her vision. I think the more she uses her vision, the better her vision gets, which then brings me back to you better be doing stuff they're really interested in. That if you're going to just do find the get the point to, they're not going to want to do it. That you've got to figure out how to engage. And then when they're engaged, they're going to want to do things that are going to help improve their vision. I don't think CVI would disappear. That's not the point I'm making, and I think you'd probably agree with me on that. But I've seen kids' vision, again, we're not talking about acuity. We're talking about the information they get from their vision and their ability to use their vision to learn, get better over time when they're worked with. Not when they're left to their own devices, but when they're worked with. So I'm wondering, as our time is ending, if any of you invisible people there, really, you must look way worse than I do. That's all I can think of, and I've been up since 2:30. If you have any questions, we would love to hear them. You can put them in the chat box if you don't want to talk, or you can ask us something. Gosh, they're quiet. They really are. Oh, there's somebody who might want to say something. You have to unmute yourself, though, but you look beautiful. You could have been on camera the whole time. Look at you. I love it.
Hi. It is nice to see you all again. We saw you last time in one of the webinars, and it's good we are able to connect again. So I have been working with my daughter since a couple of months, and recently she got her device, her own device, and then we started modeling actively in this time. So one of my concern is for the first point that you said, response is slow in Rett and Rett syndrome. She has a Rett syndrome, and even it is same in CVI.
Yeah.
So I wait for, So when we are doing any activity or when we are using her device, so I wait patiently, give her a time, and of course she responds very well, and then whatever she responds, I compliment her and encourage her. But then with the device, what I see is, as you said, it takes a little bit of time to warm up at the start, and then she might get used to use all over the screen. So that she does. So she takes time to warm up a bit. Like I believe she tries to scan all over the screen, but at the left side of her vision, she selects some of the feelings, on the right side of the screen, she selects the feelings and her personal and all word list, etc. And after some warm up, she uses all over the screen and navigates through pages. So my question is, when she's using any device, that time it's very easier for me to know what she wants to say, and she's getting it that. But when I'm presenting her any static object which is not making any sound or not making any music, and they are not in her central field, they are at the top left or the top right side. So they do not. She won't. She won't look at those objects because they are very static and they are not making any noise. And I need to give lot of my play tactics to get her attention to them. But that would be a very quick gaze and then come back to the center field. So I'm struggling here to find out, like, does she really have a CVI or not? So recently we got her assessed through blind low vision early intervention. They say it's a CVI. It's a CVI for her. But again, I am concerned, like, is it really a CVI or is it just because of the Rett syndrome and the visual processing?
You know what? I think that's the $1 million question. I really do. I mean, without short of getting a scan of her brain, I think that could be more indicative of what's going on. But here's what I would say is sometimes I think we get hung up on the label when really what we should be doing is looking at what it's presenting and how we're going to work with it. And so is it helpful to expand her field of vision? Yeah, I think it's helpful to play those games to expand her field of vision. But let's say I need to teach her something. I'm going to probably bring that into her field of vision and not try to combine teaching her new field of vision and new information. So new information is going to stay where she's most comfortable. Things that she already knows, I might move into other places, but I don't ever try to do two hard things at once because I don't think that really helps. So the novelty of it is hard enough sometimes, and now you're putting it into a field that she's not as good at getting to. But with Rett, the problem is how much of that not getting to a place is apraxia versus vision. And I'm not distrusting the person who evaluated her at all, but I do think that that's kind of I think what Stephanie even said is, how do you what do you do when you can't really get a consistent response, which we can't in Rett? And how do we discriminate between the two? But if I'm finding a child struggling, whether I call them CVI or whether I call them a pink pumpkin, to me doesn't matter as long as I'm exploring what's going to help them get the most information consistently. At some point, the diagnosis might help for services or things, but from my perspective, it doesn't matter if it's called CVI or visual processing. I've got to figure out what I'm going to do about it. And I don't mean I'm not belittling the diagnosis. That's not my realm. My realm is, what am I going to do about what I'm seeing? So I would just keep trying to expand her vision, but when you're trying to present things to her that are static, I would keep them in the middle where it's easy for her.
Yeah. So for the device, I see that she is using it very well. Like, she goes in different fields of the device and she navigates the pages. She chooses from the all worldies.
How old is she?
She's 3.5, 3.5.
She's how old?
3.5 years.
3.5.
Yeah.
If it's 3.5, she's getting around her device and navigating between pages. I'm not overly concerned about her vision, to tell you the truth. I mean, that's a lot for a 3.5-year-old to do. It could be, and again, I'm not debating the diagnosis at all. All I'm saying is whatever you're doing is working to help her want to get around her device and keep doing it, because you're doing a great job, Mom. Yeah.
I just got her assessed from the early interventionist, so that for me to know just what other people think, because I think that it is visual processing and it's taking time. I need to give her time and patience and encourage her. But even I wanted to see how others look at it and what they want to say about it. So it's not a formal diagnosis. They have just assessed it, and I wanted to get into neuro-ophthalmologist. So the process is like first step assessment, and they would refer us to the neuro-ophthalmologist later.
Okay. All right. Somebody has asked, there's some questions that are up here. Could I explain the visual perception of a CVI person? Well, I guess it depends on that person. I mean, you go all the way from kids who literally can look at their mom and not know it's their mom, that not recognize that visual image of that person as being their mom. So that would be the worst of CVI, where they're really not getting any information from visual images. And it's not that they're not seeing it. It's not acuity. It's not farsighted, not any of that. It's that the processing of visual information back to the brain. There's that connection is the problem. So it goes all the way to that, to kids who are, seeing, aren't seeing color. I mean, it could go with color blindness. I think when things kind of go together, they kind of go together. But it also could go to kids that really aren't discriminating. Like, they would never watch TV because those images for them are just not meaningful. But yet, if you put the printed word on the page, that is meaningful. They will listen to books and they will use their devices to talk. They will read on their devices, but it's set up in such a way that really helps them visually. Does it have to do with focus? Can they be nearsighted or farsighted? Sure. All of these things can go together, but the nearsightedness and farsightedness would not be the CVI. That would be separate. That would be acuity. And do things kind of go mingle together? Sure, they always do. I mean, the kids that I work with that have the worst CVI are actually kids with CP. They've already got significant brain damage from the CP. It's not a far cry from having the damage related to CVI. Them having the most severe cases. My girls with Rett syndrome, my boys and girls with Rett syndrome present as a little bit milder than that are definitely taking in lots more visual information, but definitely have a lot of those markers that get them the CVI diagnosis on evaluation. That was okay. The visual perception. Yes, please, can I add a suggestion? Yes, you can add a suggestion. Go ahead, Stephanie. Was that you?
Yes, that was me. Sorry, I actually was sending it to Miss Sawant, the woman who just spoke. But okay. I was just going to say, I mean, if it is CVI for her daughter, if she's having trouble accessing those lower fields, again, I'm not going to say your daughter has CVI or not, but things like that I've used with kids with CVI to model is if you there are these little finger lights you can get on Amazon for very cheap. And you put one on your finger and it's got, you can have whatever color they prefer. And as you're pointing and touching and modeling on their device and things, there's that light to draw that visual attention lower. Also, those, they called like the rave bands that you wear, the glow in the dark rave bands, also can be something you can use as almost like a magnifying glass to put your, a circle of light around, things to try to draw attention to those lower fields. Because typically that's the difficulty with most kids with CVI or people with CVI is from the nose down is where you have limited visual abilities.
Yeah.
I sent you links though. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hey, listen, are you going to be here the next time, Stephanie? I'm hoping, because we're going to talk about strategies. So we might have you do a little part of that. We'll get a hold of you, and it's always great to have. Oh, go. All right. I love this. You know what? I do think that there's so many people on here because I think that it's an area that is not talked about enough. I think it's an area in schools where teachers, I'm a teacher, I taught grad students for years, so I know where we're lacking in our education about complex kids. And I just don't think there's enough. I'll go into a building and it'll be like, okay, where's the vision person? And they're like, well, yeah, she comes here like once a month. I'm like, oh, gotcha. And it seems like those services get stripped away and so overloaded. And yet, how important is vision visual processing and the ability to take meaning from what we see is so key. And the part for me that hurts me is the same part that hurts me about girls with and boys with Rett in general, is when you can't follow a command and do what people ask you to do, they right away leap to this cognitive deficit. And I think that's such a disservice, because if we don't understand where the confusion's coming from, we're just putting them in a bucket over here and saying, yeah, they just can't do it. And that I just refuse. I just refuse with all my might to do that, because I feel like it's incumbent upon us to figure out how to make it work. So Stephanie, I'm so glad you're here, because anything more we can learn to help kids, I would be like so happy, because when I learn something new, I'm like, I've already written down 3 things that you said that I'm going to try. I just value. So thank you so much for coming. And thank you everybody for coming. And hopefully this was of help. In another month, we'll take a look at strategies in advance. If you have questions, please send them to us. Send them to Courtney's address is there, Courtney@gp2c.org. I'm Susan Norwell at rett-u.org. Just send us the questions. We can incorporate them into our talk. We'll reach out to Stephanie, make sure that we've got all the latest and greatest in terms of strategies, and hope to see you back here in another month.